So I don't know if anybody is familiar with the Juicebox podcast. It's actually a great podcast on type 1 diabetes, and I've learned a ton of what I put into practice thanks to that podcast. There's things that I like and there's things that I don't like, but I primarily gravitate towards the informational episodes. Anyway, it was interesting because I think yesterday, Monday, the 14th of August, they had their first Omnipod 5 episode, and they had the second one come out as well. I just finished listening to them and I found them incredibly helpful. And also, one of the most interesting or kind of funny coincidences was that the guest on the podcast is a nurse from the Barbara Davis Center. I live in New Jersey, but I'm actually in a clinical trial at the Barbara Davis Center as well. And ironically, I just got back yesterday from a one-day visit to do a follow-up. I'm in one of the, I forget what it's called. I think it's called MAS1, but it's a series of experimental injections aimed at retraining the immune system to see if the attack on the beta cells can be slowed. If that study is successful, it would really be helpful, not necessarily for me, but for family members who have, or relatives of people who have been diagnosed and maybe have the antibodies or have low C-peptide levels and would like to extend the honeymoon period or hopefully prevent it from type 1 from ever developing. But anyway, long story short, I was at the same facility as the person on the Juicebox podcast, so I found that to be pretty funny timing. Anyway, what they were saying, I think is really helpful, and there's some things that actually matched with what I was told yesterday when I was at the Barbara Davis Center myself. And that is a couple of edits to things that I said in the past. So I said that I felt like the settings got better after I changed my basal rates. Apparently that's not a thing. So what they're saying in that podcast and what they told me yesterday was that the system, only in the beginning, it's using the basal rate to help estimate your total daily insulin. It doesn't actually impact how much you're getting in those little microdoses. So I think ultimately I can kind of forget about that one. The main takeaway is from the podcast, from what I was told yesterday at the center, and also just what I've been experiencing, is that the total daily insulin is the biggest factor in how aggressively it's going to correct, based on, of course, the settings that you put in there. So let's say you get all your settings in good shape and you're wondering why the automated mode is not correcting you more aggressively. I believe the answer is it's looking at your total daily insulin and it's trying to make adjustments off of that. So for example, one of the ways that can be a struggle is sometimes for me, I don't always bolus all of my meals. Like if I'm going to the gym, I will not bolus the stuff that I have beforehand. Or if I'm correcting a low, I will not bolus what I'm putting in my system. Or if I'm having a low protein or a low carb protein bar, like a Quest bar, which I have all the time, I don't usually bolus those. And I kind of expect the system to correct me. But what I'm going to do moving forward, and what I think sounds like a good recommendation, is to at least put those carbs into the bolus calculator, so that the system knows that you are eating food and you will need a certain portion of insulin. Because what it sounds like it's doing is you could technically use like the automated micro adjustments to help you correct, but it's going to do that more slowly, and it's not going to really recognize that your actual body needs that additional insulin. And so even if you put in, let's say, 20 carbs and your blood sugar is already at a good range and you don't necessarily need more insulin, just putting it into the calculator is at least going to tell the system, hey, this guy is having 25 grams of carbs. He would, if he had no insulin on board, need X amount of insulin. And so I think it's just a good habit to train the algorithm to really everything that you're consuming, just throw it in the calculator. The calculator is going to a lot of times predict or give you no additional insulin. So I think what I've learned is that I should start to trust that calculator a little bit more, assuming that my correction factors and my insulin to carb ratios are good. So like even if it says 0, I'm still going to put it in there just so the system knows. Because ultimately what I'm trying to say is I want my total daily insulin dose to go up a little bit so that the system can be a little bit more aggressive. And I'm not going to fudge that number, but I am going to start to tell it every time that I'm eating so that it actually knows I need insulin instead of just figuring it out after my blood sugar rises a little bit. The other thing that I was told when I was meeting with the clinicians at the clinical trial yesterday was that I could try to be a little bit more aggressive with my carb ratios. I'm already much more aggressive than I was with MDI, but they said, listen, if you're still going up or you're still at a range that you don't want to be, you can make them more aggressive. This is particularly true for me at night. I haven't been going low at night at all, which is fantastic. So I've been sleeping through the night, but my numbers have been higher than I would like. I'm still averaging between well, let me take it back. If I don't eat 3 or 4 hours before dinner, my blood sugar overnight is perfect. It's like a nice straight line at around 120 or so, and I love it. If I eat anywhere within like 2 to 3 hours, even the most healthy things, even if I try to bolus right before bed, like accounting for a fat or a protein rise, I inevitably spend the whole night at like 150 to 170 or so. And that kind of messes up the daily average. And so what they recommended to me is to increase my correction factor, especially overnight. So you can do your correction factor in different segments. And my correction factor from like 10 to 6 a.m. is what I'm going to particularly try to make quite a bit more aggressive. I started off by talking about like my carb ratios. So, but it's interesting because at night I'm more sensitive to insulin. So my dinner time carb ratio is actually much greater or much less aggressive than my morning, but then I need a higher correction factor. So it's kind of weird. So just to summarize, the lows or the highs that I know that some other people that are using this are experiencing at night, they could be related to food that's still processing your system. They could be related to your liver that's releasing glucose. But one suggestion would be to play around with your correction factor in that overnight window and see how it goes. So me personally, I think my correction factor for the overnight hours was at 1 unit, lowers my glucose by about 70. And I'm gonna try to change that tonight to 65, just a small change to see what it does. And then I'm gonna progressively get more and more aggressive with that. So I hope that should help with overnight. So I mean, I think I'm on pod 6 now, and it really is working quite well. I mentioned yesterday that I went to Colorado to go to the Barbara Davis Center, and that was actually a pretty good test of something too, because it was a monster of a day. I got up at 2 a.m. to fly out to Colorado, and then I was actually doing a glucose tolerance test for like 2 or 3 hours at the facility, so I had to fast on my way there. And it was a nice test of seeing if my blood sugar would stay stable. You're walking through the airport, you're stressed, could go down, could go up. It actually stayed remarkably stable in my trip to Colorado. And then when I was coming home, it was actually quite good too. However, I kind of screwed it up at night because I really hadn't eaten all night, and then I had to take a flight back. So it was 2 flights in one day. I got home and I was absolutely exhausted, and I kind of just shoved a bunch of straight up carbs in my mouth, and I woke up at like 200. But that was my fault. That was not Omnipod's fault. So long story short, it was actually really good and really reliable, and it made the travel experience much easier than on MDI. And so I really liked that too. So yeah, I would recommend anybody listen to those Juicebox episodes that just came out. It sounds like there's another one that's going to be coming out. About to listen to the second one myself, but so far the information has sounded exactly on target. And more than anything, the biggest takeaways I think are nail down your insulin to carb ratios, nail down your correction factors, play around with them, see what actually works, and then understand that the aggressiveness or lack thereof of the algorithm itself is going to come primarily from total daily insulin. So my interpretation of that, again, make sure you're not faking any carbs, make sure you're not eating things without putting it into the calculator, even if it's not recommending a dose. And be aware that sometimes when you do put in like a mealtime dose and it's not the number you expect, take a second to think about, or at least remember, that the automated basal doses could be already counting as insulin on board. So there may be situations in which the dose that you take for lunch, let's say, is less than you would typically take. Before you change it and manually write something in, look at some of the math or look at your history to see how many of those micro basal doses were just given. Because in many cases, it's possible that you have, like, let's say 0.3 to 0.5 units already on board because you were getting those basal units. And now you're doing your bolus for lunch or whatever. So don't just manually override it at least at first. Just look into it and start to get familiar with the concept of these micro adjustments sometimes impacting either positively or negatively your bolus doses. I thought that was a really insightful thing that I learned over the past couple of days too, because I had kind of been manually just writing and whatever. So these are just some additional little tips. Again, my thoughts are kind of scattered. I didn't really sleep much last night, and it was a crazy day yesterday. But with all this information coming out, I just wanted to kind of highlight the fact that I thought it was funny that I was just talking to the people that are now on this podcast, and the information is very consistent and pretty positive. So I think it's all good stuff, and hopefully this helps.